Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Scale with Predictable Success. And today I'm absolutely delighted to have my good friend and colleague, Jenni Catron. Jenni's the founder and CEO of the Foresight Group. And for the purposes of our discussion today, most importantly, she's the author of this wonderful book, Culture Matters, a framework for helping your team grow, thrive, and be unstoppable. Who doesn't want to have a team that's unstoppable? Jenni, welcome to Scale.
Les, thanks so much for having me. Always enjoy our conversations.
Well, that's a point. Full disclosure, we know each other quite well. We've known each other for quite some time. We're colleagues. We just at the time we're recording this, totally coincidentally and without planning, we were just back, each of us from Chicago, where we shared a stage at the Global Leadership Network's Base Camp Conference,
Yeah.
which was a great
Yep.
conference. And a tendency I have when somebody comes on who I know well is to assume that all of our viewers and listeners know you that well too. And many
For
of them I
sure.
know do, but some of them won't. So I'm going to ask you to do two things because I happen to know, having spoken with you about the book on a number of times, to tell us a little bit about your own journey
Sure.
to getting to the point of, running your own company and how that got you to needing to write this book. Because I know you needed to write it. It's not just, I know a labor of love when I see it, right?
Right,
It's
right.
something
Yeah.
that you've got to get out of your system, right? This
Yep.
is one of those. So tell us the story of how you got here, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's in Culture Matters and why it's important.
For sure. For sure. Well, the journey is always an unexpected one. I started out in the music business in Nashville. I thought I'd be a CEO of a record company. That was dream job since I was about 13 years old. And I had the privilege of doing that for almost a decade. And then I went into nonprofit work. I worked at a large church in Nashville, Tennessee, and was there for almost another 9 years. And then shortly thereafter, I launched the Foresight Group. And the theme, the thread that was running through everything that I was doing was that I was so deeply passionate about figuring out how to lead well. Because frankly, Les, I was a horrific leader in the early days of my
Sure,
leadership
that's not
journey.
true, but
I was super driven, ambitious, wanting to make things happen. And sometimes I saw people as like, kind of the cogs in the machine to make it work rather than really part of the responsibility that I had.
right.
And so there's lots of learning, lots of really good mentors who spoke into my life. And so I was working in really purposefully on my leadership growth, but I also kind of stumbled into the power of a great team and just the joy and the fulfillment of doing work with others when you really embraced that like belief that working you can go farther working with people than just what you can do independently when you kind of really internalize that. And so I launched the Foresight Group. Now it's almost 8 years ago, and really with a heart to help leaders be healthy and thriving and teams to be healthy and thriving. And so that's kind of been the journey. In the book became the reflection of that work of almost over 20 years of in the trenches trying to figure out what makes some teams great, what makes some teams not so great. Those early years of the music business, I started out in a fantastic team. Like I was kind of spoiled.
Right.
Um, First team was I was a part of a company that was on a rocket ride of growth. We were every bit in fun and having a blast. And and hitting all of the metrics and the sales targets and so forth. And I was just learning and thriving as a young leader. I was part of a team where I felt connected. I felt a sense of belonging. I was being stretched. I was growing. I had pretty clear but ambitious goals that I needed to achieve. And I was absolutely having a blast. And then we went through a corporate merger.
Right.
And overnight, the experience went from amazing to awful. And I just remember feeling this tension of like, what just happened to me? Like, what in the world just happened? My job hadn't changed, my responsibilities hadn't changed, but my leader and my team had changed. And so that's like that first memorable experience to me of the significance of culture, that culture really matters.
Right.
And I just became more and more curious. And so I went on to lead in different environments. And in every environment, I just kept trying to figure out how do you build a great team? How do you intentionally, purposefully build a team, not just with some perks and fun stuff, but like the things that really rally a team and pull a team together? And so Cultural Matters became a reflection of that
Right.
journey and that my own curiosity of how do you do this well?
And you know, that pivotal moment of moving from that vibrant organization into the merged, you know,
Yeah,
less vibrant version, something that many of us have been through, if not all of us,
for
in
sure.
some form. But that's sort of indicative of the fact that culture is a little bit like the thing that I work in a lot, which is complexity. You don't
Hmm.
you don't notice it until it's an issue, and in
That's right.
complexity, in the case of complexity, that it's there and threatening you. In the case of culture, it's that it's not there anymore, right? It's the absence
That's
of
right.
it. And you tell a particular story involving a Mexican restaurant that was sort of a it was like a wake up moment for you that what you had before had gone. I'd love if you just share a version
Yeah.
of that with
Yeah.
our listeners.
Yeah, it was a funny little wake up moment for me. So the what was happening is I had joined the church in Nashville as executive director, and we were a small team of about five of us. And so I'd come off of my experience in the corporate world in the music business, great first few years. The last year was that merger that was really just not fulfilling. And so I started the role at the church saying, I now sit in a seat where I disproportionately shape the culture. Like I am now one of the senior leaders. I'm going to be shaping the experience that the team has. So I went in with that understanding, but I still didn't know how. Like I knew that I wanted to create something that looked like my first experience, but I didn't know how. So what we did in those early days, and this is typical small team behavior, is we would do staff meeting every Tuesday, and then we would go to the local Mexican restaurant for lunch. And again, bonding over chips and queso, like I know no better, like great team event.
Absolutely.
And so we did that, and it was it was just part of our culture. It's just what we did. And you talk a lot about like that flock ball thing where everybody, everybody's around the ball and doing everything
Right.
together. That's the stage we were in. We were just doing everything together, and it worked. We knew our culture, the who we are and how we work together. That's how I define culture. We knew that because we're all together. We all got it. And so we did that, and that continued. And then handful of years later, we it was another Tuesday. We decided to stay on site for lunch that day, and I don't remember the whys. I just remember something was happening that we needed to stay on site. So about 12:15, I get a phone call, and it's the local Mexican restaurant who are very
Right.
kindly saying, "Hey, Jenni, we're just checking to see if you're coming today." And like Les, it was that memorable moment of like, oh my gosh, because here's what had happened. I was quickly envisioning this. They were prepared for us because what they had done going on probably 5 years is every week we'd walk in, they'd have our tables ready.
Right.
But we were no longer five. There were
Right.
30 of us on staff. So
Right.
this amazing people at this restaurant would string together tables that took up at least half of the restaurant, and they would be ready for us every Tuesday. Every
Right.
Tuesday they were ready for us. And what I recognized in that moment is that I was unwilling to accept that we had grown, we had changed. We couldn't expect culture to be caught. We couldn't expect to keep doing the same things
Right.
at the scale and the size that we were. And so it was just somewhat silly example, but such a wake up moment for me that my unwillingness to accept that I had to lead differently in how we were leading at a much, larger scale, because it wasn't just impacting us. It would like our dear friends at the Mexican restaurant were bearing the brunt of my unwillingness to recognize I needed to lead
Right.
differently because we were a different team at that stage.
Right. And it it then prompts when something like that happens. It prompts you to think something that feels competing with culture, which is how can I codify what we had? How can I bottle it? How can I
That's right.
make it replicable? And one of the reasons I so love your book, and again, full disclosure, we're going to push everybody to go buy this. And when they do buy it, they'll say, I've recommended it in the book because I think it's just a phenomenal book. The thing that I love most about it is most books and culture, they sound good, they read well, they've got all the right words, but there's
Sure.
nothing to do with it afterwards. You can't
Yeah.
actually take principles
Actionable.
and apply them. But you, you haven't done that. You've actually put a structure together to building good culture.
That's
So
right.
I want to talk in a second or two about specifically that structure. What do you
Yeah.
recommend people
Yep.
do? But before we get there, I'm just always interested with any author. Did you know you were going to have a structure-based book when you
Mm.
started?
I would say I knew it when I started the book because I'd been workshopping it for so long.
Ah, okay. Well, I was
So,
clever. I wish I'd
yeah.
thought of that.
Here's the truth of it. I was recognizing that again, and this is what you taught me through predictable success was that, as teams grow and you're attempting to scale, you're going to bump into that white water
Right.
and not only bump into it, you're going to be in it. And you need to build the systems that help support the growth that you want to continue to see happen in your organization. And so that's the mentality I took into the culture work was to say, well, gosh, we all know and intuitively create cultures when our teams are small, when we can be in proximity to everybody and we can shape and influence how who we are and how we work together. Well, that's relatively easy. But we don't, so we know it when it's great in those smaller environments, but we don't know what to do with it when I get to 30 team members and we can no longer sit at the Mexican restaurant together. So I had to distill what is it that I'm trying to hold on to and how do I do that at scale? So I took some of that thinking and some of the learning that I'd had, as I was scaling other parts of the organization that I was in. And so what do I do? How do I do that with culture? So I that's what I began to workshop. And so the first like almost 7 years of my business at Foresight, when in the culture work that I was doing, I was really digging deep, going, what are the things that are producing great culture? What are the things that produce culture at scale? And the fascination that I found, Les, and I think sometimes culture gets a really bad rap because people think ping pong tables and you
Right.
know,
Beanbags.
pizza, yeah, beanbags and pizza lunch, or whatever it is. But in actuality, as I was talking to teams and talking to organizations, the things that were producing the best cultures at scale were very intentional points of clarity that the leader was providing, clarity of mission, clarity of vision and direction, clarity of organizational structure. So many of the things that are part of the predictable success model
Right.
were things that were showing up in building the consistency and the predictability that helps team members know how to contribute. So I
Right.
found this really fascinating relationship between clarity and trust because everybody wants trust. That's the buzzword in teams.
Right.
Everybody wants trust. Well, what I found is that there were things that we as a leader had to provide in order to create a measure of trust. And so again, it goes back to things that you and I both know and love so much. It's that clarity of are we providing the basic needs that team members have of mission and direction and goals and an understanding of this is how we succeed together.
Right.
Are we giving them an understanding of where they fit in the organization, the roles, the responsibilities? And then as we create those things, well, then they're more confidently contributing because they have clarity of understanding how we
Right.
show up.
Right.
And as I diagnosed my experiences back at the record company in those two different scenarios, I was like, that's what was missing. And then we build the connection, the belonging, the things that we want, the relational outcomes we want in organizations.
Right.
But so many times I see us fixate on the relational pieces when in fact there's those organizational clarity components that are so critical to setting a foundation for trust that helps team members engage.
Right.
So anyway, I just found all these kind of unique things that I was like, culture is not what most of us think it is. It's, we want the outcomes of the camaraderie and the connection and the sense of belonging and
Right.
the trust, but the inputs, that's the system we need to create, or what are we inputting regularly to produce the outcome we want.
Yeah, it's not gooey. Culture is not gooey. It may look gooey, it may feel gooey when it's,
Right.
in
Yeah.
flow, but it isn't. So, and I'm about to ask you to do what, when I get asked to do it, I think if I could do this well in 17 minutes or whatever subsection of a podcast is, I wouldn't have had to have written the whole darn book. So I realize you're only going to give us an umbrella view of it. But tell us about that structure. What is the approach that you recommend people take if what they want to do is either recover if they've lost their culture
Yeah.
or codify, keep, build, sustain the culture that they have? What are the stages that you recommend they work through?
Yeah. Yeah. So I ended up defining 5 phases that I call the lead culture framework. And 5 phases, and I show them kind of in a circular pattern because they really like it's kind of a cycle that you
Right.
repeat as you keep living into the culture you aspire to. So the first one is just to simply assess, where are we? Like, what's our reality? Because there's no perfect culture. We're a bunch of imperfect humans trying to work together to achieve a goal. So what's our current reality? And I caution leaders because it is really hard to get an honest assessment of the experience your team is having, especially the larger your team is, the harder it is for you to understand what the experience is like throughout the organization. And there's a myriad of ways that you can do that, but be deliberate about assessing your current reality. Where are we? Secondly, the second phase of the framework is to define, what do we aspire to? So we need that picture of what do we, my favorite question to ask is, what do we look like at our best, right? Like
Mm,
what do we hope for? What do we aspire to? And sometimes you can define that maybe in a recent project or something that your team has worked on together, and you were like, gosh, I want more of that. I wish
right.
we looked like that most of the time. Or maybe you're reflecting on, a point in history, and you're like, okay, what about that was so really reflected who we are and how we want to work together. So define it. And again, there's a lot of ways we need to define it. The thing that I would tell, especially founder owners and founder leaders, is that you intuit, and it's probably true of most leaders, but I find this particularly true of founders who grow things that scale, is they intuitively know what they hope for in their culture, like how they want their team to show up, but they haven't put language to it, right? They
Mm.
they know it when they spot it. And so what happens is it presents as micromanagement because
Ah,
something happens organizationally and it pricks a really core value to that leader, but that
right,
leader's never actually articulated why they care about the thing they care about. I'll give you an example. I have a leader that I worked with who had a high value on the environment of the organization, like the aesthetics.
right.
And they were doing a new building project, and he came in and changed the color of all the baseboards. Well, of course, that meant change orders for the work crew. And like, his operations person was frustrated because he's like, I had no idea you cared about the color of the baseboards, you know? And this is a pretty good size organization. So it's like the kind of thing you wouldn't think the founder cared about. But he had such a high value on the aesthetic environment that he wanted more input, but he never articulated that. He just assumed everybody got it. Everybody knew that that mattered to him.
Right.
So then he would come around and he'd be changing things and rearranging things. And it was driving the team crazy until he got clearer about defining, hey, this is something that's really important. This is what it looks like. So every leader has that thing that is so common to you, so obvious to you
Right.
that you assume everybody's got it. But the key part, and I'm kind of emphasizing this phase because that clarity of definition, of that clarity of, hey, here's who we are, here's how we work together, here's what's important to us, here's the values that align us. The more you can provide language. Now, the bigger you are, the more the culture is not just you as the leader, the culture is the collection of the group. And so you've got to make sure you're
Right.
considering the whole group in that equation. But particularly for founder-led organizations, they're disproportionately influencing how that culture is formed and shaped. So the
Right.
clearer you can define it, the more success you're going to have in the third part of the process, which is to build the plan. So my aha in this, Les, is that I'm a strategic girl. You know this because I love a good
I do.
strategic plan, and
I
I
do.
love the predictable success model. As soon as I got my hands on it, I was like, this is the plan I need to help me lead my team through whitewater. Um, so I love a good plan. And then what I discovered is that nobody has a plan for culture. In fact, research tells us that 90% of us say it matters, like culture matters, like engagement is important, but only 25% of people have a plan. So we leave it to chance. We just think, oh, okay, I think, they'll just get it. They'll just
Right.
understand what's
Right.
important here. Like, but just like every other key initiative in our business, our culture needs a plan. And that was probably the most surprising thing to me, and probably is the biggest aha for the leaders that I work with, that it's like, of course you need a plan to actually equip your arguably greatest resource, the talent, the people that are helping you achieve the mission. They need a plan. We need a plan for how do we close the gap from where we are to what we've defined we want to be.
Right.
And so there's a ton of rigor in that. That's where the system part of the framework really comes into play, is looking at all the different places in our the rhythms in our organization, the employee journey, so to speak, inside of the organization. How are we making sure that we're reinforcing that vision of what we aspire to as a team?
Right.
And then the fourth phase is equipping. How do we make sure every leader at every level isn't sabotaging this thing? Because that's where we find it happens often, is we can do all the work of assessing, defining, building a plan. But if our leaders, especially like our mid-level leaders, aren't equipped to understand it and help support it and reinforce it and coach it, then we're kind of dead in the water. So that's where the leadership part of the work comes into play, is like we need every leader at every level equipped to help facilitate it. And then finally, commit is the fifth phase. And that's the, hey, this isn't a one-time episodic thing that you do and
Right.
forget. It's a system that you is part of your rhythms as an organization. It's a system you're committing to. So again, I kind of visualize it as a circle, that so then you go back and you assess again. And I recommend about once a year, just a check-in. How are we doing? Clarifying, how are we lined up to what we've defined? Do we need to add anything or change anything in our plan? How do we make sure our leaders, do we have any gaps, and making sure our leaders are helping reinforce the best of who we are? And we do it again, and we do it again. So 5 phases that really became the framework to building a healthy culture.
And we're going to, with your permission, just have an outline of that graphic on the show notes.
Oh, for sure.
So they can work there. I want to take you back for a moment or two and just hone in a little bit on the assess and define, the first 2 stages there. There's got to be a degree to which, a large degree to which, that's got to be based in some sort of reality, right?
Right, right.
But we've all dealt with a mismatch between a presumed assessment of who we are and 2 things. Either, yeah, that's incredibly aspirational. We've seen the big words up on the wall,
Yeah.
and then you wander around and you think, well, it would be nice to see all of that. But so we've got the really aspirational stuff that is maybe forward looking.
Right.
And I want to hear you talk a little bit about that in a second or two. And then there's the what I've used, the retrospective definition, which is looking back at the myths and legends of the business that were all achieved, back when the Mexican restaurant, you were only 6 of you going there. And you can't assess and define a company that's moved way beyond that in those early terms. And yet I see founders trying to, put history back in a bottle and use that.
Right.
So let's
Right.
start, let's take each of those separately. First of all, to what extent, when you're working, personally with people, do you find you've got to, push back a little and say, that's a great phrase or word or intention to build into your culture, but you really think you're there yet?
Right.
So where does aspiration come in? Is it a valid
Yeah.
thing?
Yeah. It's a great, great, great question. And so one of the things when I'm working with a team, Les, is I will have them build a culture team from team members throughout the organization. So our instinct is to use our senior leadership team, and have our most senior team members around the table to do all of this work, to assess and define. I actually discourage that, because again, the perception that the senior leaders have is not as accurate as team members throughout the organization will have. So one of the first steps we do in even pre-assessment is define, okay, who's that culture team? And I want team members from throughout the organization. I want them at different, levels in the organization. I want admins and coordinators, and I want 1 or 2 senior people. I want people who've been there 10 years and I want people who have been there 10 minutes. Like I want this
Right.
really broad swath of team members. Now, it's still going to be a team about 10 to 12, so that we can have good, healthy conversation. But what I find in that is it helps us get that actual understanding of our reality and even a measured um, awareness of the aspiration, right? Where it's
Right.
like, okay, there's always a level of aspiration when we define culture, but if we're just defining something that is so aspirational, everybody's going to roll their eyes.
Right.
We're going to be dead in the water, right? Like to your point, and all of us have done this, that we've done some exercise, we've written some organizational values, we've put them on the wall, and everybody's rolling their eyes when they walk by them because they know that's not at all how we operate. And now I'll give you a little like caveat nugget to this. There's an organization that I've worked with for a handful of years now, and I was doing another round of assessment with them, and I had some team members express, yeah, gosh, there's a couple of values that still feel so aspirational. I want to give up on them. Well, that's like really, really important data because then we have to go,
Right.
okay, why? What is pulling us back to that historic behavior? And, is there something we can address, or have we written something that's too aspirational? It's not true to who we are or who we might be. So to answer your question, getting that team of leaders from all different parts of the organization to be a part of the conversation is a helpful like push and pull
Right.
on what we're defining we want
Right.
to aspire to. That's probably the most helpful thing I've seen. Is the Another thing that I'll do in that context is I'll also, we'll work on that aspiration of defining the how we work together, and we'll get some language, we'll get some stories, we'll get some behaviors and things out. And then I will say, okay, 1 to 5, how aspirational is that? And I have every team member privately score, usually we're doing this around values work. And
Right.
I'll have every team member privately score them of like from 1 to 5, 1 being
Hmm.
um uh that's true. That's who we are, to 5 being very aspirational. Like we're not at all there. And then we'll all put our scores up. And that's again really helpful to see
Right.
everybody's response to which ones feel so aspirational. And then we go back, then we workshop it
Right.
some more to go, okay, what do we need to adjust? Is it time for this? Like, is this unrealistic? Is this something that is just not true to who we are? So, again, a good blend of voices that are bringing different perspectives becomes really powerful in helping dial that in.
And well, two things from what you've just said. That ranking between, the 1 to 5 thing. I, I think there's a comparator here to must have skills when you're hiring people. They don't have them, you don't hire them. And good
Right.
to have, great when they have it. It makes them, gives them a competitive edge in the interviewing process. But if they only have good to haves, they don't have the must to haves, there's no point in taking them on. And I think there are must have cultural imperatives that,
That's
frankly, if people frequently abrogate them, they shouldn't be kept on in the organization.
that's right.
When was the
That's right.
last time we fired somebody because they were broaching our cultural norms? Well, that
That's right.
can't, and from what I hear you saying, that can and shouldn't apply to every aspect of culture, but there is a core that should be that important, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And so what we'll also find in the plan, um, the build phase of the work is we're looking at, okay, once we've defined that culture we aspire to, and we put really good language around it, we bring as much clarity as we possibly can to it, then we're saying, how does that show up in our interviewing? And making sure that as we're selecting talent, we're
Right,
looking for people who really align with what we've defined. Then we're making sure it's showing up in performance reviews and regular like feedback conversations of, again, this is where equipping our leaders is so critical, that
right,
they're helping create conversations and provide coaching around those values to make sure every team member is actually living into them, or they're being coached to. Because then if they're not, then we're having a discussion about whether they're a good fit for the organization. So yeah, what you're defining is like that's part of that system that reinforces the health of the
Right.
culture of saying, hey, how do these things show up so that we're frequently having conversations, we're frequently leading towards it.
Right. And I think it is always quite funny when working with a leadership team and you see that they're really up for enforcing cultural fit for certain hires. And then there's a group that, like the call center,
Right, right.
why would you bother, Well, that's just a slippery slope, you know.
Completely. Yeah. Completely. And that's part of what, to consider as you're working through this, because every seat in the organization is so critical that they're operating around those values we've defined and that culture that we aspire to. But yeah, and that's why I love having people. There was one team that I worked with, and they had one of their grounds crew was on the culture team. Now, most organizations that would not even be on their radar.
But
But the
why? I
real
agree with you. But why? When you think about it logically, they've got incredible amount to contribute.
completely, and they see everything. That was the thing that we found by having that individual in the room, is that he saw everything. He interacted with, I think he was more than grounds, I think he was facilities as well. So he interacted with every team in the organization.
Right.
And so their experience with him and his experience with them was so critical to, again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get really clear on who we are and how we work together so that we can achieve our mission. We're trying to remove the roadblocks. We're trying to
Right.
remove those points of just misunderstanding or lack of alignment with how we show up and how we work together.
Right.
And so to be dismissive of different parts of the team would be to suggest that those roles are not needed to make the mission happen, when in fact, they wouldn't exist. We wouldn't be paying for them
Right.
if they weren't critical to helping us ultimately accomplish everything we're doing. So those are some of my favorites. So I probably have a little bias, but I love bringing in the unexpected team member who
Right.
sits maybe a little bit on the fringes or is more in the background,
Right.
because they have so much insight into the best of the culture and the worst of the culture, frankly.
And also, once you've got it to a certain point, involving your supply chain, I think, is important as well. Are we showing up like this for you
Completely.
as
Yeah.
suppliers, as customers, as clients?
Yeah.
So, I think you've answered the question for both the misalignment issues, which is make sure that this isn't just a small group of folks who are bringing their preferences here.
That's right.
Make sure you've got a broad consensus of what culture really should be for us. I want to, as we move towards closing, I want to just break out from the book. Culture Matters, by the way, available everywhere good books are sold. From the book just on its own, and talk about the work you do with culture. What's a typical client? If we had typical clients, our work would be boring and we'd both do something else. But what's the sort of profile that what the cool kids call the avatars these days?
Sure.
Who do you find yourself working with on culture?
Yeah, I tend to find leaders who have kind of been where I was in that Mexican restaurant example of they've been building and growing a team, and all of a sudden you wake up and you realize, oh, like I have to think about this differently. Like we've grown to a another stage of growth. And so I love working with those leaders that are, in predictable success language, they're likely in whitewater and they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we do this? How do we grow this? How do we get through this really uncomfortable stage? Because that's where we tend to see and feel the fractures of culture, of like, we start saying things like, that's not how we do things here, or and you're starting to feel that lack of control
Right,
because
right,
things that used to be intuitive and everybody understood and everybody got and it just felt like it came with ease, all of a sudden isn't, because now we have 30, 50, 100 people across multiple locations or different divisions and departments, and we've lost that sense of control, and you still want that camaraderie, that connection, that sense of team
right.
that is so valuable. So I love working with those individuals. I also, another key place that we work is when there's a leadership transition. So maybe a most senior leader exits the organization And now we have to kind of redefine. We have a new leader coming in, there's new vision, there's new direction, and that always impacts culture. So that's another key place that we engage, because along with redefining mission and vision and goals and direction for the organization, you're also having to reaffirm who are we and how do we work together to achieve this.
Right.
And so bringing clarity to that at a key, most senior leader transition is also a really key spot for us. So those two are probably where we feel like we can serve the best and engage the most.
And do you have um, a market or a group or a type of organization that you most enjoy working with?
So because I have a background with working with a lot of faith-based organizations, those are fun for me just from a values alignment
Right.
of leaders who are people of faith, but they might show up in nonprofits, they might show up in businesses. It's kind of like I'm not forward facing. The book doesn't like overly, it's easy for you to share it with anybody on your team.
Right.
But because I'm a person of faith, it's just, there's a nice values alignment in working with people who
Right.
kind of share that same background.
Yes, it's interesting that cause-based and faith-based organizations, it feels much more of an imperative for them because of the fact that there's an underlying cause or a faith. But the reality is, you know, all of us mercenaries on the for-profit side need it even more because we don't have that thrum of
That's right.
of a so-called mission, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yep. That's
So,
exactly right. Like it, yeah. And that aligning function of, again, I use values as an anchor. It's not the only thing that defines culture, but it's a big piece that defines culture. And so, especially in the for-profit space where you can say, hey, here are the things we really care about. These are the things we really want to make sure are elevated for us to succeed as a team.
right.
That gives you that anchoring piece that, like you said, a lot of faith-based or cause-based organizations will naturally have some of those things.
Mm.
It becomes a stronger anchor, I think, in the for-profit space.
So tell all our viewers and listeners if they want to find out more about how to reach out to you, more about the book, more about you, where do they go?
Best place to go is culturemattersbook.com. So simply culturemattersbook.com. That takes you technically to my website. So you can see all kinds of information there, a bunch of bonus resources and extra things. There's a podcast that I host, lots of extra downloads and resources and fun tools to explore there.
Super duper. So culturemattersbook.com. It's in the show notes. Go there, get all the additional information. Jenni, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a delight. This has been a wonderful fortnight, to use my good British expression, because we got to spend some IRL
That's
time,
right.
as the kids say. And
That's right.
I look forward to having you back on it another time.
Les, thank you so much. Thanks for being just such a champion and encourager. You did give so much encouragement and support to the book, and I'm really grateful for having me on the show today. Thank you.
Absolutely my pleasure. All right, Jenni, thank you. That was masterful, as it always is in talking to you. You're so
Thank
good
you.
at what you do. Um, I want to just spend a couple of bonus minutes with you, if I can, for our
Yeah,
subscribers and listeners.
sure.
I got two questions for you. The first one is, what did we not get into? What did we not have time or didn't touch on
Mm.
that you most wish we could have had a little bit of time to talk about?
I touched on it just a smidge, but I will say this, Les. One of the things that is becoming a growing point of awareness for me in the work. I've thought so many times about how you've talked about the predictable success model and how it's like you keep learning and growing from the model too. It's like, how many decades worth of work have you put into it and you keep discovering things. Well, I
Right.
hear you in the back of my mind as I'm building out this model and going, I keep learning things from it. I keep finding additional things in it. And one of the things that's standing out, again, I referenced it briefly, but I'd love to unpack it a little bit more, is making sure our mid-level leaders are actually helping support the culture we're defining.
Uh,
I'm seeing this show up in a lot of research around the pressure on mid-level managers and organizations that team members are more skeptical and less trusting of senior leadership. So they have higher expectations of their direct manager. So they're looking for their direct manager to not only give them direction and, the goals, but they need them to be a coach, they need them to be mentor, they need to help them learn the soft skills of leadership because they're coming in, employees are coming into the organization lacking some of those traditional
Right.
skills that we find ourselves expecting. And so there's so much pressure on that mid-level leader to equip and support the team.
Right.
And typically, they've been pushed into those roles of leadership and responsibility without a lot of training for the people management side of it. It's like, oh, you were a fantastic
Mhm.
individual contributor. Now let's make you head of the
Right.
department. And with all the hiring challenges a lot of organizations have felt, we've had a lot of times promoted people somewhat out of desperation, to fill slots,
Sure.
and we haven't equipped them to know how to lead people well. And
Right.
it's a completely different skill set. And so what I'm finding over and over as we're doing assessments with organizations is that there's a mid-level leadership challenge that if we don't get that right, first of all, they're getting really discouraged and we can have a lot of turnover there.
Right.
And or we're seeing a lot of turnover below them because people are not getting the support that they need. Or so I just like want to emphasize that making sure we're equipping those leaders um, at those levels in the organization is really critical. When I was at the record company way back in the day, they had a process in their HR team that if you were going to be promoted to managing others, you had to be a part of a 6-month program where they trained you on all kinds of people management skills.
Hmm.
So you couldn't be promoted to that role
Right.
until you had completed that certification inside of that organization. Now, that sounds crazy and a bit bureaucratic, but I look back on it and I think, gosh, I don't know. I mean, I still wasn't a great manager. It took me a while to learn and grow through that. But if they had not been purposeful to equip me, then I really wonder how much I would have been
Uh,
floundering and frustrated and
right.
how much the team would have been. So I just want to highlight that I'm seeing that as a growing issue. And it completely they're unintentionally sabotaging culture because they're lacking the skills to know how to lead others well.
Right. Right. That makes a lot of sense. The second question is, I know when I start working with someone, oftentimes I'll think, and this sounds like I'm being really smart, so it's going to come out that way. Um, I'll not even try to be defensive about it. But I think, if we had talked like a year ago, there just wouldn't be quite so much dirty fingernail work needing to
Sure,
be done here. And
sure.
we're all like that, right? We just let things get to the point where,
Right.
I've got to work on this. And 9 times out of 10, the person I'm working with would admit that. They'd say, I really didn't pay attention to the signs at the time
Sure.
I was going to hit
Yep.
or hit white water or whatever it is.
Yeah.
What are the early signs that
Mm,
you would say to folks, look, keep an eye out for whatever, because that's a sign that your culture does need a bit tightening up.
yeah. Yeah. I love that you highlighted this because I think if one of my, I don't think I've told you this, so this was coincidental, but one of my missions is to say if I can get everybody to be proactive about culture instead of reactive, I
Right,
think the world of work would be so much more enjoyable for everybody.
right,
Because what I often find is I get called, probably similar to you, I get called when it's in crisis. I get called when the board is finally like, time out. There's
right,
too much turnover. You're excusing too many things away. Something's going on. You've got to bring somebody in to help assess this.
right,
And to your point, then it's like, gosh, there's so much heavy lift, because a big part for us, and I think it's true for you, is that there's so much behavior change required in the work that we do. And behavior change is not easy change. You're
right,
trying to lead people to something that they haven't experienced before. They default to their typical practices. And so there's so much heavy lift required. To answer your question, the signs that I would say are, first of all, if your team is over, if there's more than like 6 of you that fit around the table, you need to start defining your culture. right? As soon as you can't, I mean, you should define it at that point even so, but when everybody's around the table, you can kind of get away with it.
Right.
So as soon as your team eclipses like a dozen team members, you've got to get purposeful about building a system to support your culture. Um, if you are seeing a little more turnover than normal, but people are kind of just giving, you know, not scathing reasons for why they're leaving, but they're just kind of,
Meh.
yeah, yeah. Um, so you want to pay attention to that if you're seeing a little more turnover than normal. If you are in rapid growth, so let's say you're in a season of rapid growth, it all feels fantastic because growth is covering a multitude of sins. Like
Right.
the feeling of succeeding
Mhm.
is covering a multitude of sins.
Right.
But
Right.
typically there are fractures below the surface where the team are starting to feel those pressures. There's some tensions, but we're still winning. So we keep just focusing on the wins. But if you're in a season of pretty rapid growth, pay attention to culture because the fractures exist. You just are, they're not standing out yet, but when they do, you'll feel them
Right.
significantly, or
Right.
as soon as that tide begins to turn and you hit a rough patch, then it all begins to crumble. So those are a couple things. I mean, obviously if there's greater tension within the team, if there's more gossip and infighting, if you're hearing I don't really understand my role, or I don't understand how so and so works, or you're hearing anything that would indicate a lack of clarity around roles, responsibilities, um, then I would pay that's another
Right.
sign as well. And it likely feels obvious to you. You're thinking, well, you do this, you do X, Y, Z. And so you try to give a 30-second response to that to placate it, but it pops up again. Like, so if you're hearing it repeatedly, or people are expressing confusion over what they're responsible for, or who does what organizationally, that's another kind of warning sign that we need to take a time out and get more serious about culture.
I would add one other, entirely my own prompting, which is if you are just about to or thinking of implementing an employee satisfaction survey or whatever cool
Oh,
phrase you've given it, don't do that. Call Jenny. I see it all the time. People have
yes.
fundamental problems, cultural problems, and they, oh, we'll start pinging the employees. Well, that
Yeah,
may be part of your final toolkit. That is not going to solve your problem.
that's right.
Excuse me. In fact, on its own, it almost always makes things worse because
Yes,
then
yeah.
you don't do anything with it, and you're into a
And
vicious circle.
yeah, that you're completely correct. Because some people will be like, "Oh, assessments, we've already done those, and it didn't matter." Well,
Uh,
did you do anything with
right,
them?
right,
Because as soon as you open that up, there's a hope that you might actually listen.
right,
And if you don't actually respond, and it doesn't mean that everything an employee sees is something you have to take action on, but you have a responsibility to respond to it, to bring
right.
clarity, to say, to acknowledge, what the experience is, so you can clarify, hey, here's who we are and how we're working together, or hey, here's how we plan to address that. But so many times we do the survey, we look at the data, we don't like it because it's uncomfortable. I mean, one of the
Right.
things I tell leaders all
Uh,
the time is like, this sucks. Like, because
right.
you have to be confident and comfortable enough as a leader to say, like, I need to know the just honest feedback from the staff, and
Right.
it's never as good as I think it is. Like, I just encourage leaders all the time, just start from that premise. Start from the premise that it is not as good as you think it is. Be prepared to hear some feedback that you're not excited to hear, but now at least you have the data. Now at least you can say, okay, well, that's the experience they're having, right or wrong, what I intend or what I didn't intend. Now I have intel. But if I don't do anything with that, to your point, then it's actually worse on the culture.
Love it.
So having a third party help facilitate that is really powerful in the process as well.
All right, everybody. Culture, as you have heard today, it matters. Go to culturemattersbook.com. Jenny, absolutely incredible, wonderful as
Thank you.
always. And everybody, will see you next time on Scale with Predictable Success.